house 3 weeks ago. It was an old Victorian on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town. The kind of place with peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and a faint musty smell that never quite leaves. I didn't mind. It had character. And more importantly, it was cheap. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days unpacking and my nights with a glass of wine, reading in front of the fireplace. The silence of the house was comforting at first, but by the end of the second week, I noticed something peculiar. The layout of the house didn't make sense. From the outside, the house appeared symmetrical. 2 windows on each side of the door, a neat row of 3 above. But inside, the proportions were off. The hallway on the second floor seemed shorter than it should have been, and there was a strange void between my bedroom and the guest room. It was like a slice of the house had been shaved away. But I brushed it off. It was an old house. Maybe I was overthinking it. Then I heard the noises. It started late one night, faint scraping, like nails on wood. I was in bed staring at the ceiling, and at first, I thought it was coming from the attic. But the sound wasn't above me. It was coming from the wall that shouldn't have existed. The next morning, I measured the hallway. I measured the rooms. I even counted my steps. There was no denying it. The space between my bedroom and the guest room was missing. There had to be a hidden room. Excited by the discovery, I started searching for an entrance. I tapped on walls, hoping to find a hollow spot. When I reached the far end of the hallway, my fingers brushed against something odd. The wallpaper, faded and yellowed, had a small tear. I tugged at it, and a chunk came away in my hand, revealing a narrow, vertical seam in the wood beneath. I was staring at a door. It was thin, barely wide enough to fit through. There was no handle, just an old keyhole. My pulse quickened. I tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. It was locked. For the next 2 days, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. Where did it lead? Why was it hidden? I rummaged through every drawer and cupboard in the house, searching for a key. Nothing. Frustrated, I decided to break it down. It didn't take much effort. The door was brittle, and the wood splintered under the force of a hammer. As soon as I cracked it open, a cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it a smell so foul it made me gag. Rot. Decay. Something worse. The room beyond was pitch black. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The beam of light illuminated walls lined with stained, peeling wallpaper. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there were no windows, no furniture, just emptiness. Then, the light caught something on the far wall. Words scratched into the plaster. "Leave him alone." My heart stopped. The words were jagged, uneven, as if carved by trembling hands. Before I could think, I heard it again. The scraping. This time, it was louder, coming from the far corner of the room. My flashlight flickered. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. The scraping grew louder, closer, until I could pinpoint the source. There was a small vent in the corner of the floor. Something was inside it. I crouched, shining the light into the narrow grate. At first, I saw nothing but blackness. Then, something shifted. A hand, thin, pale, and impossibly long, curled around the edge of the vent. I stumbled back, tripping over my feet. The hand disappeared, retreating into the shadows. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, hoarse and whispering, echoed from the vent. "Don't look." The flashlight died. The room plunged into darkness. I scrambled for the door, my breath hitching, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed everything I could and left. But as I was loading the last box into my car, I noticed something. A figure was standing in the upstairs window, staring down at me. I couldn't make out a face, just a shadow, unmoving. I drove to the nearest motel and spent the night there. I told myself it was over, that I'd leave the house behind and never look back. But then, I started having the dreams. In the first dream, I was back in the room, standing in front of the vent. The hand reached out again, but this time, it wasn't alone. There were eyes, gleaming and bloodshot, staring at me from the darkness, and then, the voice spoke again. "You shouldn't have opened it." I woke up drenched in sweat. Over the next few nights, the dreams grew worse. In one, the vent was gone, replaced by a gaping hole in the floor. Something crawled out of it, dragging itself toward me. Its limbs were twisted, its face obscured by a tangle of hair. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it reached for me. By the end of the week, I was too afraid to sleep. But even in my waking hours, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. Objects in my motel room weren't where I'd left them. And then there was the knocking. It started faint, like someone tapping on the walls. But each night, it grew louder, more insistent. On the third night, I finally worked up the courage to open the door. There was no one there, just an envelope lying on the ground. Inside was a single piece of paper. Scrawled across it, in the same jagged handwriting I'd seen on the wall of the hidden room, were the words, "You can't leave." I don't know why I went back. Maybe I thought I could end it. Maybe I thought I could make it right. Or maybe I just didn't have a choice. The house was colder than I remembered. The air felt heavy, oppressive. The door to the hidden room was still open, the darkness inside beckoning me. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand. The vent was there, just as I'd left it. But this time, the vent was open. I don't remember what happened next, just flashes. The hand clawing at my leg, the voice screaming in my ears, the walls closing in around me, and then, nothing. When I woke up, I was lying in the front yard. The house was gone. Not burned down, not demolished, just gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the empty space where the house had been. I don't know if any of it was real, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scraping.
The property was perfect, or so it seemed. A modest cabin tucked away in a dense forest, with the nearest neighbor miles away. It was exactly what I needed. Peace, quiet, and a place to escape the city's relentless noise. When I found it online, the listing had warned about the condition of the cabin. Rustic was how they described it. And sure, the plumbing was outdated and the roof leaked during heavy rain. But I didn't care. The land was the real draw, 10 acres of untouched forest that felt like my own private sanctuary. It wasn't until my third day there that I discovered the well. I had ventured deeper into the woods, past the tall pines and tangled underbrush, when I saw it. A stone circle, covered in moss, its edges crumbling with age. The opening was wide, framed with jagged rocks, and as I peered over the edge, I saw nothing but blackness. There was no sound of water, no faint echo, just an abyss that seemed to swallow all light. The air around it felt colder, heavier. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt uneasy standing near it. I backed away and hurried back to the cabin, trying to shake the strange feeling. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest, so tranquil during the day, was alive with noises after dark. The usual sounds of crickets and distant owls were replaced by something else, something unnatural. I heard rustling outside the cabin, not the gentle movement of leaves in the wind, but deliberate, purposeful steps. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear more. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, like the faint tap of a branch against the window, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was a steady pounding against the door. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept toward the sound. My fingers hesitated on the lock as my mind raced. Could it be a hiker, an animal, or something worse? "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped. Silence. I held my breath, waiting for a response. When none came, I opened the door just enough to shine the flashlight into the darkness. There was no one there, just the empty forest, still and quiet. But as I closed the door, I noticed something on the ground, a trail of wet footprints leading away from the cabin, back into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been an animal. Maybe a bear had wandered too close, curious about the cabin. But deep down, I knew better. I decided to explore the woods again, to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. Armed with a machete and my flashlight, I retraced the path I had taken the day before. When I reached the well, I froze. The moss-covered stones were slick, glistening as if freshly wet. The air was colder here, the silence deafening, and then I saw it. Faint scratch marks on the stones, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at the edges. My flashlight flickered, the beam of light sputtering as I moved closer. I peered into the darkness of the well, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a ripple like water disturbed, but there was no water, only shadows. I backed away, heart racing, and hurried back to the cabin. I should have left right then and there, packed my bags, gotten in the car, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed another night. This time, the knocking came earlier. Just after sunset, as I was lighting the fireplace, the sound echoed through the cabin, louder than before, more frantic. It wasn't just at the door this time. It was at the windows, the walls, the roof. Like a dozen hands were pounding from all sides, demanding to be let in. I grabbed the machete and backed into a corner, clutching it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The fire had died down, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had come for me was gone. But then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the direction of the woods. "Come back." The voice was faint, almost melodic, but filled with something sinister. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. "Come back. Come back." It wasn't until dawn that the whispers finally stopped. I left the cabin that morning. I didn't bother packing. I just grabbed my keys and drove, not stopping until I was hours away. But even now, I can't escape it. At night, I still hear the knocking, the whispers, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the well, waiting for me. I don't know what's in there, but it's calling me.
I took the job at Hollow Bridge Cemetery because I needed the money. It wasn't the kind of job anyone wanted, caretaking for a place that most people avoided. But it paid well, and the hours fit my nocturnal schedule. The cemetery wasn't much to look at. A sprawling lot of moss-covered gravestones and decaying mausoleums. It was bordered by a dense forest, the kind where the trees seemed to huddle together, blocking out the sky even during the day. The first few weeks were uneventful. My duties were simple: clear away dead leaves, patch up damaged headstones, and make sure the gates were locked at sunset. My boss, an older man named Carl, gave me only one piece of advice when I started. If you see the lantern, don't follow it. At the time, I had laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of initiation joke for new hires. Carl didn't laugh with me. He just stared, his expression grim. "I'm serious," he said. "If you see it, stay inside. Lock the door. Wait until dawn." I nodded, pretending to take it seriously, but I didn't think about it much after that. The cemetery was eerie, sure, but there were no ghostly lanterns or anything like that. At least, not for a while. Then came the storm. It was late October, and the wind was howling through the trees as rain lashed against the caretaker's shed. I was sitting inside, sipping coffee, and listening to the tin roof creak under the weight of the downpour. That's when I saw it. A faint, flickering light moving between the gravestones. At first, I thought it was a trick of the storm. Lightning, maybe. But the light didn't disappear. It bobbed up and down, weaving slowly through the cemetery like someone carrying a lantern. My first thought was that a trespasser had somehow gotten inside. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, muttering curses under my breath as I stepped out into the storm. The rain was relentless, soaking me to the bone within seconds. I kept my eyes on the light as I moved through the rows of graves, my boots squelching in the mud. "Hey," I called out, "the cemetery's closed. You're trespassing." The light didn't stop. It moved further away, towards the older part of the cemetery where the mausoleum stood. I picked up my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the sheets of rain. The closer I got, the more I realized something was off. The light wasn't casting any shadows, and it wasn't steady like a lantern. It flickered and pulsed as if alive. My chest tightened. Carl's warning echoed in my mind. "If you see the lantern, don't follow it." I stopped in my tracks. The light was just ahead, hovering near a crumbling mausoleum. The storm seemed quieter here, the air heavy and still. I wanted to turn back, but something about the light drew me in. It wasn't warm or inviting. It was cold, pale, and unnatural. And yet, I couldn't look away. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering as I approached the mausoleum. The light moved inside, disappearing through the cracked iron gate. Against my better judgment, I followed. The inside of the mausoleum smelled of damp earth and decay. The light hovered in the center of the room, illuminating the walls lined with dusty plaques. Then it began to move downward, seeping into a hole in the floor that I hadn't noticed before. The hole was surrounded by shattered tiles, as if something had broken through from below. A faint sound rose from the darkness, a low, mournful wail. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't. I knelt by the hole, shining my flashlight into the void. The beam didn't reach the bottom. The wailing grew louder, echoing up from the depths, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many, a chorus of anguished cries that made my skin crawl. Then the light shot back up, blinding me. I fell backward, hitting the floor hard. When I opened my eyes, the light was hovering above me, pulsating wildly. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled out of the mausoleum, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm had picked up again, and the rain felt like needles against my skin as I ran back to the shed. I locked the door behind me, collapsing into a chair. My clothes were soaked, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the light, felt its cold presence. The next morning, Carl came by to check on me. I told him everything, expecting him to laugh or dismiss it, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded solemnly. "You're lucky," he said. "Most people who follow the lantern don't come back." I wanted to ask more, but he didn't elaborate. He just gave me a look that made it clear I wouldn't get any answers. That was my last night at Hollow Bridge Cemetery. I quit the next day, packed my things, and left town. But even now, I can't escape it. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I see a faint light flickering outside my window. And I wonder if it's come back for me.